Okay, folks. Well, thank you very much for joining the presentation wherever you are in the world. I'm James Nisbet, and I'm part of the committee on the UK Society side. And I'm going to put up my presentation now. So if you just bear with me. So hopefully you can all see that. Ed, can you see that? Yeah.
Yep.
So the presentation is all about building an accurate Nisbet family line. And this affects us all because we're all interested in where we came from, and the information that we're gathering, is it factual, and where are we gathering that information from? And sometimes we believe, with good reason, that what we're being told is the truth. And in some cases, it's an urban tale. And I can relate to my own family line where I grew up as a boy believing that my great grandfather had been to the Klondike to get his fortune. And unfortunately, he didn't get a fortune. It wasn't until I started doing my family tree that I found out that the Klondike that they were talking about was the local coal mine that he worked in near Edinburgh. So all these years I thought he was getting gold. In actual fact, he was getting coal. So let's crack on and see what we've got here about this particular gentleman here, who is Alexander Nisbet, born about 1731, and he died in 1773, and he's often referred to as Alexander born at sea. And when you look at the documentation regarding Alexander Nisbet, you will find the documentation that the surname spelling changes. And that is typical because the spelling of the surname or any name is dependent on the person taking the record. And Nisbet 104 is his WikiTree ID. So why are we looking at Alexander Nisbet? Well, we're looking at him because we all encounter obstacles in our family trees and often rely on others' research to overcome them. However, it's crucial to critically evaluate the information we receive, and this exercise that we're going to demonstrate tonight will show the consequences of not questioning the accuracy of others' claims. And as I say, although we're talking about Alexander Nisbet here, we could be talking about anybody's ancestor, so it should help us all. So what do we think we know about Alexander Nisbet? Well, he could have been born around 1731, but there's no birth record to determine where. He may have married to Agnes Ramsay in 1751, but again, there's no marriage record. He died on the 23rd of July, 1773 in South Carolina, and there's doubts about the accuracy of Find the Grave, which is one of the record sources that people will go to. He had 8 children, all born in South Carolina from 1752 to 1770. And we do have Y-DNA people. We have people who have taken Y-DNA tests in his direct paternal line on WikiTree, and they are Adam Nisbet, Guy Nisbet, Carl Nisbet, and Bill Nisbet. And based on the Y-DNA results, Alexander has been categorised as related to the Nisbets of Greenham, which is Ayrshire, Scotland, in WikiTree. We should also note that there could also be DNA tests within FTDNA that have not yet been recorded on WikiTree, and this will become important as we go through this presentation. One of the reasons that we want to be using WikiTree is that is a preferred site for the Nisbet Society, and within WikiTree you will never get duplications, so there will never be 2 James Nisbets born in Scotland. You will get a prompt if you try to put somebody like me onto it to say consider this person, because it may be the same person that you're talking about. What we cannot establish about Alexander Nisbet is that he was born at sea, that he has direct links back to Scotland through a paper trail, who his parents were, a statement attributed to Laura Ann Nisbet that Alexander was born at sea, information contained in Nisbet Narrations by Newton Alexander Nisbet in his book called Nisbet Narrations. And if we want to look for information, the hot topic at the moment is artificial intelligence. So for a bit of fun, I went and used ChatGPT, and there are other sources you can look at for AI. But I asked the question, who was Alexander, born about 1731, known as born at sea? And it came back to him and said, Alexander Nisbet, born around 1731, was a Scottish lexicographer and author. He is primarily known for his work, A System of Heraldry, published in 1722. Nisbet's comprehensive study of heraldry remains an influential resource in the field. However, there is no indication that he was born at sea. His birthplace is generally believed to be Scotland, though specifics might vary. So right away, how could he publish a book in 1722? 1731, perhaps. But based on the first question, AI believed he wasn't born at sea. So the second question I asked was, are you sure you're talking about the right man? Alexander Nisbet, born about 1731, died on the 23rd of July, 1773 in Waxhaw. And it came back, what seems there might be some confusion here. The Alexander Nisbet born around 1731, who died in July 23rd, 1773 in Waxhaw, is often referred to as Alexander Nisbet of Hart Hill. He was a Scottish immigrant to the American colonies and is best known for being the paternal grandfather of James Knox Polk, the 11th President of the United States. Waxhaw is an area that straddles the border between North and South Carolina. Alexander Nisbet of Hart Hill was indeed born in Scotland, but later settled in the American colonies. So it's saying here that he's now connected to a President of the United States. So I went, was Alexander Nisbet really associated with the President? Where is the evidence Alexander Nisbet, born around 1731, was the paternal grandfather of James Knox Polk, the 11th President of the United States? They come back, apologise for any confusion. It seems there might be a misunderstanding. Alexander Nisbet of Hart Hill, who died in Waxhaw in 1773, was indeed an historical figure, but there are no widely recognised evidence connecting him directly to James Knox Polk, the 11th President of the United States. James Knox Polk's paternal grandfather was named Ezekiel Polk, who was born in 1747 in Maryland. There might be some confusion or misinformation regarding the lineage. So asking these three questions, it tells us it's essential to rely on well-documented sources to establish historical connections accurately. So now we're asking the question, was Alexander Nisbet from Scotland or Ireland? And you can see on this map here that Scotland and Ireland are only 12 miles apart. So very, very close, and on a clear day, you can actually see Ireland for Scotland. So how can we help find your oldest known male ancestor? Well, using a tree with good sources published on WikiTree, and again, we're emphasising the point that we'd really want you to use WikiTree, because within it, it will ask you questions when you start putting in information. Unlike other sites where you can run parallel trees, in WikiTree, there will only ever be one line for yourself. So the Y-DNA test results fully published on WikiTree, which can help trace the male line. And again, WikiTree should pick up any connections to your tree with the test result. And we understand that the size of the DNA test may well be governed by your budget, because taking DNA tests can be expensive. So prices from FTDNA as from the 23rd of June, before any discounts, and they do have sales, so you will get good deals occasionally. So for 37 tests, for instance, it's $119, going up to $449 for the big Y. So now what we're going to do is we're going to employ the user research techniques to validate our assumptions and identify any misconceptions. So this exercise will help us all learn and expand our knowledge and understanding. And as Ed said at the start of the presentation, please ask questions, and any question is a good question. Whether it covers Alexander himself or your own family, anything that comes up on the presentation, please ask a question. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over to Bill Nisbet, who's the Vice President of the North American Society, who will take us through the research he has conducted on Alexander Nisbet. And that will be followed by Adam Nisbet, who is the North American Society's autosomal DNA coordinator. So Bill, over to you.
As we started talking about this, I became aware of documentation, especially what we mostly consider a paper documentations. But I'm a descendant of Alexander. I grew up a few miles from his grave, and the documents that I was always familiar with from the beginning were what was on his tombstone. I want to start with James's slide here about what we know about Alexander with the two first bullets. He could have been born around 1731. There's no paper record. He may have married Agnes Nesbitt. There's no marriage record. There's no paper copy, and there's no, I mean, we're talking about the place he was born and the marriage record was, and this is the picture of the graveside. Everybody see that?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, and the one on the right is Alexander. It's a single gravestone for both husband and wife, and then their oldest daughter on the left. This is the inscription on the gravestone. Memory of Alexander Nisbet, who died, and his age, and his wife on the right-hand side. Their sons are documented on this stone, and they're documented in paper too, in history. But on the opposite side of the stone it says, here Alexander Nisbet lies, and his wife Agnes likewise. And this was a change of spelling. The longer has the two T's, and then the one T is down at the bottom. My family always said the man who carved the gravestone got it wrong, and they made it put it right on the back. But of course, nobody knows because everybody used different spellings. But that's what's there. And so that was based on the deaths of the other three. This was done at least about 1800 after his wife died, and I assume since they're so alike, his first daughter, I assume they were both done about 1800. Whoops. Well, now this is interesting. There we go. So here's what we have on the stone. Two spellings of the name, as I said. It has the birth year, so we do the math of subtracting out his age to get to about 1731, and for his wife about 1727. There's no other record than this, so that approximate is as good as we can get. His birthplace is unknown, and he could have been born in Pennsylvania, Ireland, or Scotland, in my opinion. But I think that he was most likely not born at sea. And Adam, who's going to come after me, is going to explain this a lot better than I can, but I think he'll go through the documentation that he and I both have seen and explain that. The date and the place of marriage is unknown. However, their oldest child was born in 1752. And so a date of about 1751 for a marriage is not a bad assumption, but again, there's no paper, but that's what we can guess. I would also say that it was not unusual on the frontier, if you want to call it that, in the wildernesses of America, that people fell in love and began to cohabitate, and they considered themselves married. The community would, and they would wait for a minister to come through, a circuit rider of some type, and finally do a wedding. Sometimes they've been documented after children have been born. These were Scott-Irish Presbyterians all in this area. There was not many ministers, so whether they had a formal wedding or not, we don't know, but we assume that before the first child was born, they were at least married. They were married and their community did. But there's also paper about Alexander. He had 2 land grants in 1755 and 1770 along Cane Creek, South Carolina, that were filed actually in North Carolina. Cane Creek in the Waxhaws is right on the edge of both North Carolina and South Carolina. The state line was not well defined at the time, and the county seat of Anson, North Carolina County, was Wadesboro, not too far away, more accessible than the county, Craven County, which this area was from South Carolina's perspective, but the county seat was Charleston, South Carolina. And that was a long hike down to Charleston just to get to a courthouse. So they went over to the closest in North Carolina, in my opinion. That's how it happened. I would also make note that the line was so fuzzy. The tradition is every time the tax man came around, if he was from North Carolina, they would say, whoa, 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 I live in South Carolina, and vice versa. So there's a lot of confusion at the time. Alexander's will says very clearly he was in Craven County, one of the original 3 counties established in South Carolina in 1664, in the province of South Carolina. Lancaster County, where he is, where the cemetery is, and where we all grew up, is actually established 1785. And then his wife's maiden name was Ramsey, because twice in his will he talks about my brother-in-law Robert Ramsey, and Ramsey was an elder in the church there at the time. He was well known, and so we can safely say that though her maiden name is not on the stone, there's a paper source of giving that. And with all that confusion, thank you for bearing with me. I'll turn it over to Adam for the rest of the presentation.
So like Bill, I'm another descendant of Alexander, and I'd put this presentation together to present to some of my own family, and I modified it just a little bit for this one. But I had taken an interest in some of the claims about Alexander, and so tried to establish some of the sources where these claims came from and whether or not they actually were true. So Bill has talked about some of the things that we believe are true and why we believe that. I'm actually, a lot of the stuff I'm focusing on is going to be things that I found when I went and looked at the actual documentation. I think the traditional story that had been passed down to me, there were some mistakes in it. So my presentation, born at sea, or was he? Because I don't actually think he was born at sea. I think that's one of these mistakes that got attached to him along the way. So the traditional source that a lot of us got handed down is a book called Nisbet Narrations. This was published in 1961 by Newton Alexander Nisbet, who was another descendant of Alexander, and he lived right in the area of the Waxhaw area, like Bill, and so he grew up right around where Alexander was from. And so he collected a tremendous amount of history on the family, and he did a great job of disseminating this among all the descendants of Alexander, and I think ignited an interest in Alexander among quite a few descendants. And because of this, he was viewed by many, his presentation, he's got a lot of research, so it was just taken as unquestioned fact that he's done his homework and this must all be true. But while he provided us with an amazing resource, he actually also had a bit of a knack for spinning a good story. And so there's several things that he presented that were based on speculation, and there were some mistakes along the way. And so when I became interested in genealogy, which was largely actually due to his book that I read as a kid, was to go back and retrace his work and to try to, establish, okay, where did these claims actually come from, and make sure that I agreed with his justification for them. And so I wanted to, make sure if there were any errors, I could find them and root them out. So a bit of a preview. I'm going to give you kind of the family tree that he passed on to us versus a sneak peek at what I would have as my current conclusions. So this is what we were told from his book. He had Murdoch Nisbet of Hardhill, who is famous for translating the New Testament into Scots, who was back in the 1400s and 1500s. He then had a long line of descendants until you get to John Nisbet, the martyr of Hardhill, who was executed for taking part in the Covenanter rebellions in 1600s. And then John Nisbet's son, James Nisbet of Hardhill, wrote a book about his experiences growing up and about his father, who was martyred. So then Newton had James Nisbet of Hardhill connected to a John Nisbet, born 1705, and his wife Sarah Brevard. And then he had Alexander Nisbet as their son. So that's what I grew up thinking was the truth. As we've dug into some of the sources on this, we've found that this connection can't possibly be true, and we'll get into some of the reasons for that later on. And this connection cannot possibly be true, and likewise, we'll get into the reasons for this later on. So the tree that I got passed down from Alexander on back had pretty much gotten disconnected from everything, and so then I started looking around. Is there anything else that we can actually establish about Alexander Nisbet? And here's where I currently am with regard to Alexander Nisbet. I actually think I have a possible name for a mother of Alexander. I don't know what the name of his father is, but I actually think his father was the one that was actually born at sea, not Alexander. And we'll get into it later on, but I think he does eventually connect back to Nisbets in the Ayrshire, Scotland region, most likely. And because Murdoch Nisbet does also live in that region, there's a possibility that they're connected, but I don't have proof of that. So Murdoch still connects to these Nisbets of Hardhill, but we don't really know whether there's a connection between the Hardhill Nisbets and our own, though they both likely came from similar areas. So there's still a possibility that there's a relationship somehow. And Murdoch's far enough back that there's even a possibility that our Nisbets are still descended from Murdoch, but that we just have no evidence of that. So that's kind of a preview of where I'm headed. Now we'll go into some of the details of Newton's justification for his presentation and why I think they're mistaken. And then I'll go into some of the new stuff that I've discovered on Alexander Nisbet's origins. So the key questions we'll look at, first of all, what evidence is there for or against the John Nisbet that Newton had as Alexander's father? And then since I don't think that's actually accurate, I'll also look into what evidence is there for somebody else as Alexander's father. We'll look at the born at sea reference and who that actually refers to. And then we'll also look at what relationship might there be to the Nisbets of Hardhill. So in Newton's book, I've pulled some passages from that to kind of illustrate some of the relevant portions. In the first portion of
dead on point to my genealogy. I come here to
in the first portion of Newton's argument, he first says here that Alexander is not mentioned in John Nisbet's will.
Oh my gosh.
And so he says that this may imply to some that Alexander was not John's oldest son, but Alexander had been married some 4 years before this and was on his own land grant in Lancaster County. And so he says that, okay, even though Alexander's not mentioned in his father's will, he thinks he's still related. And he says that they have documents from other descendants that lends credence to this. And so he then follows it with a list of things that he thinks prove that Alexander was related anyway. So I'll go through each one of these and we'll examine his evidence versus what I found. So his first argument here is that John Nisbet was the son of so this John Nisbet's the son, John Nisbet Jr., son of John Nisbet and Sarah Brevard. And so his great granddaughter says that my father, Thomas Cooper Nisbet, often told me that we had cousins in South Carolina. And so Newton Nisbet says that this could only apply to Alexander's descendants, since all other cousins of Harriet settled in Georgia, not in South Carolina. She never traced the cousins in South Carolina, so Newton says that she doesn't know who this refers to. Well, when I went and looked at John Nisbet and Sarah Brevard, I found several examples of some of their relatives that lived in South Carolina. So a daughter of John Nisbet and Sarah Brevard lived in South Carolina, about 28 miles from Charleston. Joseph Brevard, a son of Sarah Brevard's half-brother, was a member of the South Carolina House of Representatives. So while I don't know if they still had surviving descendants by Hattie's time, there certainly seems to be evidence that she did have other cousins in South Carolina. So Newton's claim that this could only apply to Alexander's descendants seems to be a case of assumption based on lack of evidence, that Newton wasn't aware of these examples, and so he assumed that there weren't any other options. His second argument was that there's this great-great-great-grandson, Junius Wingfield Nisbet, had several charts of his families that he sent to various cousins, and on these charts he made a couple of important records. And this one here says Alexander was born at sea in 1731 and probably a nephew of John Nisbet. So he takes this, probably a nephew of John Nisbet, to indicate that there was a connection between Alexander and John. But my perspective on this is that it's clearly speculation, because this is from someone way down the line, and he doesn't even get the relationship to match what Newton's proposed relationship is. So this is rather unreliable evidence that someone way down the line has a probably statement, and it doesn't even match his proposed relationship. Then his third argument is that a great-great-grandson, James Cooper Nisbet, wrote a book, and he states that John Nisbet and his family came south in 1735. John Nisbet was a son of James Nisbet of Edinburgh Castle, who wrote the book Lives of the Persecuted, and so on. And then a great-great-granddaughter, Sarah Ann Nisbet, in some of her old letters, wrote that Alexander came south in 1735. So we have descendants of each one of the different lines, both saying that they came south around the same time, but that's still rather circumstantial evidence. There was a lot of migration going on, and you even had groups of migrants that sometimes traveled same year. So, and we've also got the first account here talking about John Nisbet and his family. He lists that John Nisbet was a son of James Nisbet of Edinburgh Castle. And what we've found recently is there's a book written by a contemporary of James Nisbet, who wrote shortly after James's death that James had no children. So I have here an example from that book. It's talking about James Nisbet, son to John Nisbet of Hardhill, ensign or lieutenant in the castle of Edinburgh, died some months ago. He was a very eminent and singular Christian. And going on, he talks about him for a little while, and then he says, a little before his death, he got my Lord Grange's acquaintance. He sometimes visited him in the castle. He said to my lord that he was the last of his old family and had no children. He had a nephew bound to be a barber, to whom he was to leave his papers in an old Wycliffe's New Testament, which had been in the family of Hardhill since the Reformation. So this, when we're comparing the two sources here, this John Nisbet claim here, or not John, the great-great-grandson James Cooper Nisbet. So his claim versus this other claim, one of the things that we want to do is look at who is closer to the actual events. This one is in the 1800s or 1900s, late 800s or early 1900s, most likely. So we're hundreds of years down the line, claiming that John Nisbet was the same son of James Nisbet of Edinburgh Castle, whereas the second account here was written within months of James Nisbet's death. They're both secondhand information, passing on information from someone else. But we also, Gene and I have looked at some stuff, and we do have records that the New Testament that had been translated from into Scots by Murdoch Nisbet ended up outside the family within a few years of James Nisbet's death. So that also validates what's said here, is that he was the last of his old family, had no children, and the description in this book goes on to say that he left this stuff to his nephew, but his nephew sold it off, and this matches what we find through documentation, and so this basically matches what documentation we have, and it's much closer to the source as far as when the events happened. So I'm inclined to put a lot more trust into this description that James actually died without any children, and so he could not possibly be the father of John Nisbet, who married Sarah Brevard. There we go. And so then the last few proofs that Newton gives as arguments for John Nisbet as the father of Alexander, he kind of all ties together. This first portion of it, it's a letter from Laura, I forget her married name, so it was a Laura Nisbet, and then she, I think it was Pritchard or something. But she's describing information that she was told about her family, a few key parts of it here. She says, I heard my grandfather say that his grandfather was born on the ocean coming to the United States. My grandfather also said that some of his brothers, note plural, went to North Carolina from South Carolina, and so on. And so Newton says, so from this record, we find that Alexander and his brothers first settled in South Carolina with their father, John Nisbet, and that he had more than one brother. I think here Newton makes a mistake about who his brothers refers to. He's taking it to refer to brothers of the guy born on the ocean coming to the United States, whereas I think it actually refers to this statement, my grandfather also said some of his brothers. So I think it's referring to Laura's grandfather's brothers, who would actually be sons of Alexander that we're discussing. So I think he misinterprets this letter, and so he's got the idea that this Alexander, he thinks this is Alexander born on the ocean, and he thinks that some of his brothers went to North Carolina. And so then this next point, he says, traditions of Alexander's descendants, which have been recorded, state that Alexander settled in South Carolina and his brother James in North Carolina. And he wants to say that this is the James that died in 1763. This statement here doesn't seem to refer to any particular source, so I don't really know exactly what he's referring to on this one. I do think he's, again, tying it to this mistaken assumption that the reference to brothers in the previous letter refers to brothers of Alexander rather than brothers of Alexander's son James. And then his final point, he says the first United States Census was taken in 1790, and the census of North Carolina does not show any other names of Nisbets except for the children of John Nisbet, born 1705, then living in the state. So he takes this as that Alexander had brothers that were in North Carolina, and the only ones we know of in North Carolina are descendants of John. So he takes that to be a definitive tie between them. But my comment on this, we're again assuming that these are references to Alexander's brothers, whereas I think in the original letter, it's references to Alexander's son James's brother. So it's a generation on down. We wouldn't even expect them to be around in the 1790 census. And proof by lack of documentation is not a good proof when you're talking back in the 1790s, where there were a lot of things that records were scarce and may have been lost. And so the fact that you don't know of any other Nisbets in the 1790 census does not prove that all the Nisbets present are of the same family. So it's kind of a summary of what we've looked at in terms of arguments against John Nisbet. His will makes no mention of Alexander, which Newton Nisbet fully recognizes. We don't have any contemporary documents from their lifetime that give any clear link between Alexander and John's families. We don't have any accounts from grandchildren or great-grandchildren describing John's children by name as Alexander's siblings. Newton believes that we had reference to ambiguous siblings of Alexander living in North Carolina, but I think he's even mistaken that it wasn't actually referring to Alexander's brothers. Their documented residences are about 70 miles apart, which is close enough that they could, you could have relatives living that far apart, but it's not so close that we would immediately assume that these are, next door neighbors, they must be the same family. And what I believe possibly the most important point is that we've now done Y-DNA testing of descendants of John's other children that are named in his will, and we've just done Y-DNA testing of Alexander's descendants. Alexander is a member of haplogroup RM269 through 4 different sons, and John is a member of haplogroup IM253 through 2 of his sons that are named in his will. And if you're not into Y-DNA testing, these may not mean much to you, but the key aspect here is that with Y-DNA, these first letters here, the R and the I, refer to the major branches of the human family tree. And so the fact that these aren't the same letter means that these 2 lines split apart way early on in human history. So, we're talking thousands of years ago, long before anybody, any humans had migrated to the United Kingdom at all. So there's no way that these 2 people were, or Alexander and John were father and son, because they came from very different branches of the Y-DNA family tree. There's still possibility that they have some sort of maternal connection, that on one of their mother's sides, you may both connect to Nisbets, but as far as being father and son, there's just absolutely no way that they're connected in that way. So then, if we have discarded John as father of Alexander, I started going to look for, okay, what do we know about Alexander? And through a Google search, I actually turned up I just searched for Nisbet Waxhaws, because that's where he lived, just to see if I could find any information about any Nisbets in the Waxhaws. And I found this journal of Alexander Chesney. And Alexander Chesney lived and fought during the Revolutionary War. He actually fought on the side of the British, but he wrote a journal during the Revolutionary War. And at the beginning of his journal, he describes his background. And so you've got a portion of it here. And in his description of his family history, he talks about his grandmother, Jane Fulton. And then he talks a little bit about her siblings that he's aware of. And one of them that he has here, he talks about a sister of his grandmother, Martha, who had been married to a Nisbet in the Waxhaws in South Carolina. They are both dead, but they have left children who live there. This was written during the time of the Revolutionary War. So if you trace his family tree, Alexander Chesney, his father was Robert Chesney, his grandmother Jane Fulton. I don't have an exact birth date, but just based on generational, I'm estimating somewhere around 1705. If we assume that he's listing off the siblings in birth order, I'm guessing that her sister Martha was probably somewhere around 1713. I don't have an exact birth date for her either. But we know Alexander was born around 1731. So if you look at these, to me, it looks like she's about the right generation to be Alexander's mother. She's described as being married to a Nisbet in the Waxhaws in South Carolina. And so to my mind, that makes a pretty good case that she could be his mother. And we have this unknown Nisbet that we don't get a first name there. Because that all seems to match up with what we know about Alexander. So like I've said, we want to be careful of assumptions. So I do still have this as a question mark because we don't have any actual documentation that directly links Martha with Alexander. It's circumstantial. There's possibly there were other siblings of this Nisbet in the Waxhaws that are actually Alexander's fathers. So this could be an aunt, or there's even, I would concede, a slight possibility that Alexander maybe had a first wife before he married Agnes Ramsay. And so to me it seems like they're far enough apart in age that it would be unlikely that Martha could be a first wife of Alexander. But again, you want to be very conscious of what assumptions we are making. So I will concede that there is still some speculation here. But that's what I currently suggest as a possible mother for Alexander, based on the information that we have here. Next, we'll get into the born at sea label. And when I went back and looked at Newton Nisbet's justification for that, he gives two sources that I can find that reference the born at sea label. One of them is a third great grandson of John Nisbet Jr., who we know is unrelated to Alexander. That one we had seen earlier. He made the note that on a chart there was Alexander was born at sea in 1731 and was probably a nephew of John Nisbet. We know the latter half of this claim is false. And so the first part, I would say, is also suspect. He's clearly relying on information passed down that's not fully reliable. Second source that refers to born at sea as a great-granddaughter of Alexander, relating what her father and grandfather, who were the grandson and son of Alexander, told her. And in this one, she talks about that I heard my grandfather say that his grandfather was born on the ocean coming to the United States. So this one, she's a great-granddaughter instead of a third great-grandson of an unrelated person. So I would tend to say that this is a much more reliable source. And so I looked at it, much more closely, because to my mind, it's the one that's more likely to contain the truth. So when we look at this statement, we've got Laura Ann Nisbet Pritchett, who is the author of the statement. Oh, I forgot to change. On the right here is what we know of her family tree from actual paper trail documentation. Her father was James Nisbet Jr., born 1796. Her grandfather was James Nisbet Sr., born 1765. And her great-grandfather was Alexander Nisbet, born 1731. So if we look at the stuff that's in the letter, what she talks about, it talks about James, her father, which matches what we know. She talks about James was my grandfather. He died in about 1846. My grandfather's wife's maiden name was Bratton. That matches what we know about James Nisbet Sr. And then she says, my great-grandfather immigrated from Pennsylvania to South Carolina. His name was Alexander. So that matches what we have here, and includes also information that he came from Pennsylvania to South Carolina at some point. Then her final statement here, I heard my grandfather say that his grandfather was born on the ocean coming to the United States. When I look at what that says, she heard her grandfather, which would be this James Nisbet Sr., say that his grandfather, that jumps up here, not to Alexander, but to some unknown Nisbet that's the father of Alexander, was born on the ocean coming to the United States. I'll also throw in here a quick, that it doesn't specifically say that we're following the paternal line. So there's also a possibility that James James obviously had two grandfathers, the Nisbet grandfather and then the Ramsey grandfather. And so could be referring to the other one as well. And I'm assuming that this is the James grandfather that she's been referring to earlier in the letter. But either way, I'm inclined to, based on what she's been describing, she's been following the paternal line in her descriptions. So I'm assuming that this is referring to Alexander's father. And so to my mind, I would say that Alexander's father is likely the one that was born at sea, because everything else that we have in this letter matches what we can find in documented history. And so I'm inclined to believe that she had reliable information that she was basing this off of. And when I look closely at what she says, we're looking for her second great-grandfather and this unknown Nisbet rather than Alexander as being the one that was likely born on the ocean. The final point that I wanted to look at was, okay, where does this leave us in terms of being related to the Nisbets of Hard Hill? And we have a very definite, we're not a descendant of John the Martyr based on the descriptions of James not having any children and being the last of his old line. And so he didn't have anyone to leave the Bible to. The Y-DNA of Alexander's descendants, however, does match other Nisbets in the same region as Hard Hill. We have here a picture of that area of Scotland. Hard Hill is in this general vicinity. You've got a few towns, Galston, Newlands, Dalville. Over here in the Long Green farm is where there's a DNA match to Alexander that's over there. That DNA test was relatively few markers, so it's not super reliable, but there's some indications that we think it might end up being, one of the closest Y-DNA matches that we have that are not actual descendants of Alexander. We're interested in doing some more detailed testing of that descent line to try to establish whether it actually is the closest relative of Alexander that's not descended from Alexander. But the main point is we've got matches that are in the same area as the Nisbets of Hard Hill. We don't actually have any documented descendants of Murdoch or the Hard Hill Nisbets with a solid paper trail. We have a younger Greenholm branch. So Murdoch was the older Greenholm branch. We have younger Greenholm branch that married into the family and possibly were cut. You had a Nisbet marrying a Nisbet. So may end up being the same DNA branch, but we don't know for sure if there's connection to Murdoch. So we have no way to know if he's descended from Murdoch's line or some other branch of Nisbets that just happen to be living in that same region. But we do know that they were related to Nisbets that were in that same region. All righty. So finally, kind of a summary of what do we know. We're most confident on the things that are not true. John Nisbet, born 1705, that married Sarah Brevard, is not Alexander's father, and we're not descended from John the Martyr. We don't know if we're descended from Murdoch. He's far enough back that there's just lack of documentation. Could be, but we don't have any documentation of it. Things that we suspect to be true, but there's still secondhand sources and some assumptions involved. I suspect Alexander's father was probably the one born at sea on the way to the colonies. I don't think Alexander was. Alexander's father probably eventually traces back to the Ayrshire, Scotland region, since we have DNA matches from that area that may end up being some of our closer matches. We're still working on trying to confirm whether that's true. And Alexander's mother was probably Martha Fulton, who came over from the Ballymena, Northern Ireland region. I suspect, since Alexander's father, I think, was born at sea on the way to the colonies, I suspect he probably lived in Pennsylvania and then moved to Waxhaw along with Alexander at some point. So I suspect he and Martha Fulton probably met in the colonies. So whether or not there was any connection between them before they immigrated, I don't know. But I don't see any real reason to expect that there would be. So kind of leaves us a bit cloudy here. There may be a connection to these Hard Hill Nisbets that we used to think were the ancestors, but it's not a direct line to them. It would be some sort of distant cousins. And that's basically where we are now in terms of Alexander's origins. But like I said, we still have a lot here that isn't fully proven with documented paper trail. It's somewhat based on circumstantial evidence. So kind of as conclusions that I have, generally, whether you're related to Alexander or not, you want to be on the lookout for assumptions and speculation. We've seen several examples here where Newton had some assumptions that were in his mind already, and he found evidence that he thought validated those assumptions. But with further evidence like DNA and or other documentation that's come to light, we found that some of those look to be false. So we want to be on the lookout for where we are making assumptions and speculation, and be very aware of those. When you're looking at documentation, try to get as close to the ancestor's life as you can. So if you've got two different sources that you're comparing, the ones that are in the ancestor's lifetime or shortly thereafter are more likely to be accurate, because over time you have more time for mistakes and assumptions to creep in. Mistaken memory and false assumptions do happen. So that's just part of genealogy, is those will creep in. We just got to be aware of that and try to, as much as we can, trace the original source of these passed on stories and assess whether anything crept in along the way where things got off track. And don't be afraid to reevaluate a traditional ancestral storyline against the source evidence. We don't want to ever get caught in the trap of being so attached to the family history that got passed down that we're unwilling to validate it against the actual source evidence. I'm very thankful that Newton had passed on the false storyline, because that's what got me interested. And I still feel a connection to the Nisbets of Hard Hill, just because for so many years I thought they were my ancestors. But at the same time, from the documentation we have, I'm finding it equally interesting to try to track down, okay, what was actually Alexander's history. A little bit more particular to Alexander's case, but still applicable to anybody. We're still looking for, we would love to find a DNA match from a non-Alexander descent line that's closely related. We've got the one from Long Green Farm that might be a close, the closest that we have so far, but there's always possibility that there's others out there that are even more closely related. So if there's anybody out there that has a direct male line descendant, and you aren't sure if your line has representation in our Y-DNA project, I'd recommend check in with Jean Scar, our Y-DNA coordinator. If you can give her your family tree, she may be able to tell you whether we already have representatives from that line in there. And then since I suspect that Alexander's family eventually traces back to the Ayrshire, Scotland region, that would be my particular focus, that if you've got people in there, we're especially interested in that. But really, anybody that doesn't have representation of your Nisbet branch in our Y-DNA project, we would love to add that in there, because while it may not connect to Alexander, it might connect to some other line that is of interest. And then look, we can always use help looking for additional source documentation. The Alexander Chesney Journal, to my knowledge, nobody was aware of that within our Nisbet group up until I found it through a Google search. And that one I found because somebody along the way had digitized it and made it available online. There may be other similar source documentation that isn't digitized and online. And so it may only be currently available if you're on the ground looking at historical societies or courthouses or churches or things like that. So if you're in the area where Alexander or his ancestors may have lived, and you want to just go poking around to see what you can find, there's always a possibility that we can find additional source documentation that we weren't aware of. And this would also be applicable even if you're not related to Alexander, obviously, for your own line. It can be useful just to look for those, alternate, some random guy's journal wouldn't necessarily be your first idea of where you would find information about your family, but just looking around to see what you can find. You never know what's going to pop up. So that's all I have for my presentation. I've got here those of us that are presenting, and also Jean Scar is our Y-DNA coordinator. So if you have any further questions, I think later on we're going to post this on YouTube. So if anybody watching this later has questions, feel free to contact us through that. And then I think I'll probably hand it back over to either Ed or Bill. And if anybody has questions at this point, we'd love to get into the discussion on that.
Well, Adam, before you change slides, we have some chat questions. James, it might be a good point now to kind of go through some of these.
Okay, let's go for it.
All right, from Buzz, this is, what town is his grave?
So I answered it in chat, but just to get it out here on the recording for those who can't see chat later on YouTube, the Alexander's grave is at the Old Waxhaw Presbyterian Church, which is between Waxhaw, North Carolina, and Lancaster, South Carolina. So it's right there on the border between North and South Carolina.
Okay, and the next one was talking about later Jenkins will discuss using DNA to connect. And so Adam, obviously you did some DNA examples there.
Yeah,
Uh,
so this discussion, I think, is talking about the John Nisbet and Sarah Brevard, I think is who that is, but I'm not sure. Gene may be able to answer that. I don't know if it's directly related to.
Adam, that's correct. That tower is a church graveyard where John and that Tower Presbyterian Church. That's where John and Sarah Brevard are buried.
I was going to say John is on this call. When you want us to discuss the DNA, exactly what did you mean?
Oh, gee. I'm here in Tennessee. We ended up with a dead end with our Tower John in 1705, the I line, the best I can figure. How are we going to match it up to anybody in Scotland ever?
Well, for the first thing, we don't even know for sure that he ever came from Scotland. That's an assumption, isn't it? And we do know that Sarah was in Ireland. That I think we have documentation for. And the thing is that we need somebody else to test that belongs to the same thing, that we have a tree that goes to some other, that goes back to that distance. I mean, DNA always has to have a tree. And who knows what'll pop up. Irish records, unfortunately, aren't that good, so that's always a problem. But I mean, I wouldn't say he came from Scotland. I wouldn't say I would say he came probably from Ireland, and I would say he probably got to Ireland from France. And how he got to France, I really don't know. But
Wow.
I'm just guessing. I'm making some wild assumptions here.
Well,
Well, and
Adam
while
said
we're
it
making,
earlier, which is something
oh, go ahead.
Adam said something earlier that I had not gotten in my brain, which was the R DNA line and the I DNA line are so far distantly related. And that then I heard the R is definitely in Ayrshire, Scotland. So it makes perfect sense that they came from somewhere else. Gene, you say from France. It might have been from, I keep telling people I'm Viking because
Well, the
some of my
reason I'm
DNA.
thinking reason I think maybe France is because where his wife was from, and I believe they came from Ireland, and she was from Ireland, there's no doubt about that, and they were Huguenots, and the Huguenots had to flee from France, and a lot of them went over to Ireland. Now, how they got to France, I don't know, and this is strictly an assumption on my side. It may be true and it may not be true. When it comes to your two DNAs, R and I, they're about 30,000 years apart.
Which is just extraordinary.
Yeah. But I mean,
Uh,
like Adam says, they can still be related even on any side, because I mean, that's just the male side we're talking about. We're talking about Nesbitt to Nesbitt to Nesbitt. But I mean, Brevard could have been Nesbitt's mother, could have been. You've got loads of possibilities there. They could have been related on other ancestry lines.
Yeah, I would say that there's a decent possibility that either John Nisbet had a maternal line that he had inherited the Nisbet name from, and so that's where you end up with the name not necessarily matching, other people of the Y DNA, or you could have, a case where there is an adoption, so he took on the surname of a stepfather or an adoptive father. And so that both of those cases are cases where you can introduce a new Y DNA that's unrelated, but you still could have some sort of relationship either through a maternal line or a stepfather line to the same group of Nisbets from Scotland. So it's hard to trace that biologically. All we can say is that there absolutely was not a father-son relationship between John Nisbet and Alexander, because if they were father and son, they would share the same Y DNA.
Right.
But I mean,
And I
there's
have
no,
to put
there's no doubt either that your Nesbitt names came at different periods of time for different reasons. We have loads of places named Nesbitt in England and in Scotland and other places. So I mean, you moved to a place and maybe that you took that name, you were living on Nesbitt, and after all, your descendants were called Nesbitt. And some of them go way back in time. So we really don't know. We just know that they started
I
at
have
some.
to, I have to put,
I don't believe John Nesbitt. I believe Nesbitt was his name, was his father's name too. But I mean, that's an assumption from my side, from what I've seen.
well, and I have to give a big shout out to Gene, who the DNA expert helped confirm my DNA relationship to who I call Thyatira John, 1705 to 1755, by helping me find some other direct male ancestors to do the DNA and by triangulation. Gene, you're pretty confident of that relationship, aren't you?
I'm definitely, because it's two male DNAs. One was taken at 23andMe, but ordinarily, if they both been R, I wouldn't have been. But when it's I and I is not that common. When it comes to our DNA, 75% of Europeans have our DNA. So it's not necessarily Scotland, it's all over Europe.
See, even Catholics, Irish.
And
Got it. So it's been a fun journey.
I would add to this discussion that, and I think Gene alluded to it, but I want to be more specific about it, is that many of the people who took on the last name of Nesbitt or Nisbet did so later in history because they lived in the town or around the house or wherever the chief man was or the chief family was, and they just adopted the name when people started saying, "Hey, you know, I know your name is John, but you know, where'd you come from? Who are you part of?" And they'd say, "Well, I'm a Nisbet. My father worked the land of the House of Nisbet," or something like that. It's like people who have the last name of Miller. Miller often means, you know, genealogically that somewhere in the back someone was a miller who had a mill on a stream, and he became known as John Miller. And so Nisbet's accumulated the name. So it makes sense to me that there's going to be a Nisbet out there whose ancestor, as proved with John there in North Carolina, that his Nisbet that they didn't connect for 18 or 30,000 years ago, however it was, and they just, you know, that's where their ancestors wandered around Europe and finally were in the same neighborhood to collect a name, but they did not, at least the male side, obviously the male side can't connect up. And so they're just neighbors who happen to have the same name, but their ancestry goes way, way, way back.
We have multiple branches that we don't know, that don't connect. Another thing I've often seen in the Scottish documents, that okay, when on the older ones, if you had property and you only had daughters, you would put a clause that in order to inherit the property, you had to use the name Nesbitt. And I've got 2 or 3 situations there. So you can say the daughters married somebody else that wasn't a Nesbitt, but they had to take the name of Nesbitt, and their children had to be called Nesbitt in order to inherit the line. And that also then, there's actually Nesbitt ancestry, but it's through a female, and the Y DNA doesn't match. So there can be different reasons.
Okay. Okay, Ed, any more questions?
Well, Dave Nez sent us a find a grave link. Dave, without trying to open up that link, was there something you wanted to point out there?
I suspect that was in response to the question of where the
Yeah.
gravestone was. I think that's a
so
link
too.
to the find a grave.
Yeah.
That's correct.
And then a little later on, John asked about Hugh.
About Hugh, okay. I have found a record of a barber named Hugh that could have been his son. It's hard to say. We can't thing that. The other thing is, he says his nephew, but he doesn't say his nephew on his father's side. It could be his wife's nephew. So maybe she even wasn't a Nesbitt. So we really don't know. And we don't have any DNA or anything to back it up. We don't have any trees to back it up. So at the moment, we don't have a clue about Hugh. Maybe Hugh is the son, and maybe Hugh had some children. Maybe Hugh never even had any children.
There's a project for somebody.
Well, that's been a project for over 15 years on my side and probably about 100 years on Nesbitt researchers. And nobody's got the answer yet.
Who is Hugh? The
Hugh,
next
Hugh,
stop
Hugh.
by the Nisbet Society. Who is Hugh?
Well, John Nesbitt the martyr is claimed to have 3 sons, and there's no doubt he had 3 sons. He had one named Alexander, and he had one named James, and he had a Hugh. There's no doubt there was 3 sons, and he had 1 daughter. That's all he had. If you go on to Ancestry, he's had about 120 sons, but that's wishful thinking.
Okay, then,
It might
Ed.
turn out, but people, I mean, look at when you look at Nesbitt narrations, it was written in 1861. That's a long time ago, and everybody's been believing that. So I mean, people have been researching this for years, and a lot of it's just finding the right piece of documentation. Sometimes we'll find it, sometimes we won't.
I think the point was made during the presentation that when people are writing books, they do it with good intentions and with the tools that they have at their fingertips at that time. So I think Nisbet Narrations was done in the 60s. Was it, Adam?
Yeah, 1961, I believe.
Yeah. So if you think of the technology that was available in the 1960s compared to what is available now, it's, you know, if that guy was writing the book now, he would have far more information to be going on. Okay,
the problem is the same you see on trees today. People make assumptions. I mean, as Adam really pointed out, you need to have the evidence. You need to have the evidence. And I look at publication after publication after publication, and the evidence is missing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and even the stuff that I've presented here, there's still assumptions involved. And it may come to light, you know, years down the road that there's documentation that indicates that, you know, my assumption that Martha Fulton, you know, was the mother of Alexander, that may be false. And so that's where it's important as we go along to constantly go back and evaluate, you know, the things that, you know, assumptions that have been made against, you know, whatever evidence we currently have to see, you know, does this still hold up?
Plus, you made it very, very clear this is an assumption, and that is the big point.
And Newton also did indicate that, you know, Alexander wasn't mentioned in John's will. Here's the reasons why I think he actually still was his son. So that's where it is. You know, when we are doing this research, it is important to document, you know, where we are getting our information. What is the reasons why we, you know, think something may be true that allows someone down the road to evaluate, you know, our assumptions and determine whether they're valid.
Okay.
Okay, I've got one more chat message, which I've been dying to get to. It's from Mike Nisbet. Mike, I hope you are still with us.
Yeah, it's interesting that on Adam's slide, it says born at sea. It's interesting that hits real close to home for me. You know, it shows directly my 3rd and 4th great grandfathers, and you know, just coincidentally, I was at the cemetery less than 2 weeks ago. It's about the 3rd or 4th time I've been up there, but I always tell people you can't swing a dead cat around that cemetery in Madisonville, Kentucky, without hitting a Nisbet headstone.
So was this a new lead for us? First time I've heard about Grapevine Cemetery in Madisonville, Kentucky.
You know, James Nisbet Sr., the one that it's in his story in Nisbet Narrations is true, I think is correct. He died in 1845. They and I've confirmed a bunch of this stuff, is that he and his family landed in Hopkins County, Kentucky around Christmas of 1800, and we're a very influential family in that area and a couple of counties. And
this is the line that the Laura Nisbet Pritchard came from,
yes,
I think.
Exactly. And there's all kind of Pritchett headstones. I mean, all of the names that you mentioned, the family names, are all in a cluster. Matter of fact, James Nisbet Jr., his son, donated the land for a cemetery and a church there on the south side of Madisonville. And one of James Nisbet Jr.'s brother, they split over the issue of slavery in Kentucky, and he moved up to southern Illinois up around, ended up around Mount Airy, Illinois, which I've been to their cemetery up there as well. And it's just interesting that just within the last couple of weeks, I was in both of those areas, and that you happen to tie this off nice and tidy for me, Adam. I appreciate that.
Okay, Ed, is there any more?
No, there's some very good comments about the presentation. But as far as anything that would be new information, I think that's the last one I see.
I was gonna say, maybe we should have the two links to WikiTree for Alexander and the thing. I just can't seem to get my chat to work here right.
If you'd stop sharing, Adam, at the moment, please.
Okay.
I do have a question for Gene.
Yep.
I see that, every day, many adjustments that you're making on WikiTree, and I have not got into WikiTree very deep yet, but what types of things what type of thing initiates a record of you making a change in there? Is it just maybe a misspelling? What types of changes are you making?
Gene, what I'll do is I'll put up Alexander's tree just to show you.
Yeah, put the 104 Nesbitt 104 and and use the
Right,
descendants.
here we go.
And use the descendants. Yeah.
Yeah.
But if
So this is the entry, Mike, on WikiTree. So there's his ID, Nesbitt 104.
go down to descendants there. Nesbitt 104 again.
Yeah. So there's his descendants.
Yeah.
And there's 298 entries on WikiTree. So all these people are now connected to Alexander Nisbet. And they may have trees on other sites, and some of them, not after this presentation, Mike, but prior to it, I think they go all the way back to Ayrshire. But we can show tonight, or this afternoon, that's not the case. And you were looking for changes, so we're going to changes. And Mike, if you need any coaching on WikiTree, then drop me a line and we can have a Zoom and I can take you through a basic run through of it. So you can see some of the changes that Gene has done. So if we look at for the 11th of September, and it gives you the time that the change was made, and it gives you a brief description. She edited the biography. So if I click on it,
Yeah, I see.
we look down. The left hand side is what was on the record, and on the right hand side is the changes. And some of the changes will be minor. Is that correct, Jean?
Yeah, it can be just a spelling, or it can be my English that I keep on making mistakes and missing commas or spelling wrong or something.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
So for
Can you-
example, in this case, there's.
Can you do that? Can you go
I-
back to the descendants and do it for 2282? Nesbitt 228. And if you do
So
the
this is-
descendants there, you get your John.
So John is somewhere down here.
Well, John is at the top. John, that's the John Nesbitt that married the Sarah Braver that was always claimed to
Okay.
be the father.
Yeah. So there's 205 descendants on this one, Mike.
Okay, thanks very much. I hadn't really taken time to get into it, but when I do, I look forward to really getting into it.
Yeah, well,
And-
as I say,
I
feel
would-
free to drop me an email, and I can give you a little bit of coaching on it.
Okay, thanks.
I would add that when you get on WikiTree, when I've gotten on it and I've connected to Alexander, of course, but I've got a lot more to add, especially on the maternal side of all my family. But what happened to me is first time I got on, I put myself in, then I put my father in, and WikiTree did a thing. Is this William Oliver Nisbet the same as this one? And it turns out that my father had already been added years ago by Gene, and unbeknownst to me, and I was so glad because when I said yes, that's the same father, suddenly the tree went all the way up to Alexander. I did not have to add anything, and I knew because it was WikiTree, everything had been verified, and so the excitement about being on WikiTree is that once you make connections, you can have a high confidence, almost 100% confidence that all those connections are correct as far as anyone knows. Now, as Adam says, you may stumble upon something and find out that maybe there's a misconnect and you need to do some more research. But it's not, I think it's 99% accurate. And it's an amazing thing when you hit upon it and suddenly, I have all these names in files, but now it's all on WikiTree and I can add to those things as Gene has done. I can say, oh, well, I'll give you the biography of my father, and I can tell you things about my grandfather, and et cetera, and add to the information, and it'll be there forever. And so I encourage you to check out WikiTree and make an effort.
Sounds like I've been down the same path you have. I particularly like the ones the news every week where they tie you back to different celebrities and different political stuff.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Which I would comment that I wouldn't place WikiTree's accuracy nearly as high as Bill would. I've seen plenty of examples where there are mistakes on WikiTree as well. The advantage there is that since everybody's working on the same tree, when you find documentation or evidence that is strong proof of something, you can add it there and it's easily visible for everyone to be aware of, rather than for example, on Ancestry, you may have 500 trees and one of them has key evidence, but only the people that look at that one tree know about it. Whereas on WikiTree, since everyone's working on the same tree, as people have corrections, they get added there, and if there's disagreement, then you go through presenting the evidence. And so if you've got someone like Alexander there's plenty of people that are interested in him, then you can quickly reach what I think would be more accurate information. If you've got a tree a line that there's not many descendants for, and so there's only one person working on it, you could easily have mistakes on that. So like anything else, you've got to evaluate the source material and what the evidence for it is. But I think WikiTree has a good system for self-correction that helps it be a little more beneficial than everybody just doing their own tree.
Great.
Well, there's one thing I like about WikiTree especially, and that's the research notes. So I could write there right away. When I started putting stuff on WikiTree, I started with a lot of the DNAs. And like on Alexander at sea, as we sometimes call him, or we usually call him, you can have a research note. Okay, it's claimed he's the son of so-and-so, but there's no proof to that. And that makes everybody aware, okay, here we've got to do more. That's the big. And when I was asked what I use when I put on WikiTree, I use sources. I've been gathering sources for Nesbits for over 15 years. And I have an extremely many hundreds of pages of sources. So sometime I might go through Maryland and add all the old immigration records or all the birth records that were there, and I do that. I also, anytime anybody adds the Nesbit WikiTree, I always go and try and add the sources to that if they're missing, or connect them to somebody that's on the tree already. And I usually, I average over 1,000 changes a month.
Wow.
And the other thing that WikiTree has, and I'm part of like the Scotland project, is that there are people working in the background checking errors within trees and making the corrections and trying to find the sources. And what you can do is you can say to WikiTree, I want to track any Nisbet that's in Maryland. anybody touches a profile across the world with a Nisbet in Maryland, it'll pop up. You'll get an email normally around midday, wherever you are in the world, and it says people have been touching this profile. And it's not unusual that you can touch a profile, make the changes, and the owner of that profile comes back to you and say, thank you very much for making the changes, or you've made an error, and you can get into some sort of dialogue. Whereas if you make mistakes on sites like Ancestry, it's just accepted.
We had one chat which I overlooked, and it said any confirmation of the connection of the U.S. and South Carolina Nesbits and the Canadian Nesbits.
Maybe I could introduce myself. The name's David Nisbet. I became aware of your society a number of years ago. Wasn't quite sure of what it was about. And so when I saw this Zoom thing came along, I thought, oh, well, this is a must attend for me. So my father is from Ireland, County Monaghan. He was born and raised on a farm called Tullynagere, just about a half-mile from the former border between the north and the south. The Nesbits have lived on that land since the 1800s, early 1800s. And we believe they settled from Scotland. And my father came over in 1850s, a true Irish policeman, part of the RUC. And my mom followed. They were engaged in Ireland. My dad came to Canada. They were married. I was born and raised in Canada, in the West, in Alberta. But we would discover later that there was Nesbits previously in the same sibling group that had migrated to Kingston, Ontario. And so that's a new revelation. We met up with a gentleman who had done a bunch of research from Madison, Wisconsin. And so, again, you're right, there's different groups of Nesbits. But of course, very curious about where things, I have lots of cousins I get to visit in Ireland, but have never gone to Scotland, never seen where the Nesbit name originates from. And of course, again, I've totally enjoyed being a part of this because it gives me an appreciation to some of the things that you're trying to address in that process. But I believe today I'm a Klingon. I don't really belong, but I've just interjected myself, and it's just an incredible surname. That's all I can say. I have a wonderful surname.
James, do you mind taking up the category section for DNA? I think some might find that interesting too.
Well, anyway, Dave, you definitely belong.
Well, as I always say, a Nesbit is a Nesbit, no matter the spelling, no matter how you pronounce it. They just got the name at some time in history for different reasons at different times and different places.
Mm-hmm.
And just because it's spelled wrong doesn't mean you're not related.
You can take the North. You can show
Well,
them.
I'm going to help you respell it correctly.
We've got 216 profiles for North Carolina that are connected to Nesbits. You can just go down and show people how that works too. Yeah. Now I've made categories for everything, so you can go into DNA, you can go into each country, you can go into each state, you can go into each, and you can find it who's there. So if we look at DNA for, take the related Nesbits to Greenholm then, 1285 is okay, it doesn't matter. ZP74 is better. So if you look there, you will find everybody. Oh, that wasn't a good one. Okay, go back one, please. Sorry about that. Just go back. Take the Y DNA related. Way over on the right-hand side.
Yeah. Here you go.
And then go down to the bottom. There I've written up about different things, how the DNA comes and how it comes. Go down to the bottom. And then go to, there should be a Y DNA. Take the ZP related Nesbitt of Greenholm, that's okay, or I don't care, one of those. ZP 74 is a good one. Now these are divided in all different types, but if you go down here, you will find all the people that belong to that group of DNA.
Hmm.
And how did you get that information?
How did I get that information? That information comes from our Y-DNA study at FTDNA.
Gotcha.
And what I've done is, okay, on WikiTree, only the person that is, as long as the person's living, only the person that has done the DNA test can enter it on WikiTree. And that's the way it should be. It's your DNA, you decide if it's public or not. But because of FTDNA, I worked on the trees against the DNA. So okay, when I go to Alexander Nisbet at sea, and people have done the big Y, I can go and I can take his DNA and I can add it as a category. I'm not saying who tested, I'm not saying who did that test, I'm just saying that belongs to that category. And from that category, from Alexander at sea, I take all his male relatives, and WikiTree then automatic, and then I would put that category on every one of the relatives. I also do it on the wives, and that's because it's much easier to look for Agnes Ramsey among 500 Nesbits than it is Alexander Nisbet, where there's I don't know how many to find the right ones. The categories make it much a way, and it's also a way. There's a lot of people that are deceased that can't put on their DNA. And it's a way of grouping the DNA without anybody saying, I did the test.
I might make a comment for David in Canada. I would appreciate somebody else's comment. If you are at a starting point and wanting to, the Nisbet narrations is available, but you can Google it. It's at many university libraries around the country. So if you're, I'm sure that there's more right than wrong in there, maybe. If not, it's an interesting family history. But if you can just Google it up, you can access Nisbet narrations online.
It's online. You can download a PDF of it, so you got it yourself if you want. On WikiTree, I also have a space. I have a space that shows all the different Nesbet publications and which ones are online and links to them.
Which Nisbet narrations, it has a little bit of information on other Nisbet lines, but it primarily focuses on Alexander and his descendants, as well as John's descendants, because Newton thought that was the same family. So he tended to focus on people he thought he was related to. So it touches on a few others, but it's going to be primarily of interest to people that are either descended from Alexander or the John and Sarah Brevard.
I would say today WikiTree is your best bet. Or
yeah. Okay. Any other questions from anybody? Have we cleared up the chat said? Is there anything outstanding there that we need to take care of?
No, I think we wrapped up the chat things, and the only thing I can add to it, for those of you who want to expand your genealogy, you've got some really good resources here. You've got Gene and Adam. They're both DNA experts within the society. They all support WikiTree. And if you can wrap your head around WikiTree, it's one human tree. And that's sometimes hard to get your head around. One human tree. We're all related to each other. It's just a matter of the pieces in between. And with James and the others, we got great resources to help. So if you have a little bit of intimidation on that, these folks will get you in and get you going quickly. I'm done.
Okay, Bill, is there any final words from yourself?
Nothing else except to say that Nisbet narrations. I prepared an article for the newsletter. One of his errors that you can absolutely laugh about is that in the beginning of his first few chapters, he went back to somebody, some Nisbet in the 1100s, and created a family tree all the way down to John and Sarah in North Carolina, and he was including Murdoch and all the rest of them. And he, you know, he has 18 generations. If you read it and accept it, you go back, you know, go back forever, and it's completely false. But that was one of the things he says, since he was my second great uncle, and I remember meeting him as a child. He was determined that the Nisbets were such a great family that they had to be documented to the greatest Nisbets there ever were. And so if he found a way to find a connection to Murdoch and the Marta and all the rest of them, he made it happen. That was part of what he did. And he did it out of a love for the family and a love of relationships. But he, you know, he just, we would say today, he just was too much in love with his own. And if you look at Nisbet narrations and you have a copy, I always like to say he had no unpublished thought. Anybody scrap a piece of paper, he put it in that book. So there's a lot of stuff you have to weed through. And I appreciate Adam doing the weeding for us on the Alexander.
Well, like I think mentioned before, it was going through his book as a kid and reading all the stuff that he had in there that got me interested in genealogy. So, you know, even if he made a lot of mistakes, he inspired people that would go through and, you know, correct those mistakes on down the line.
Well, this is the same thing that before DNA, we'd have had a hard time arguing a lot of stuff I argue today. But I mean, before, everybody descended from Nesbet, that ilk who descended from Gospatrick. It was accepted by everybody. And almost every publication you open almost says that.
Thank you all very much for attending. I hope you found it useful. I hope you have a great time researching your family now. Don't believe everything that's written in the Washington Post or the Daily Mirror here in the UK. If it's written in press, make sure that you can verify it. And the help is out there. So if anybody does need the help in getting a wee kickstart on WikiTree, my email address is available. Drop me a note and we can set up a call. There is a time difference. I'm just outside Edinburgh in Scotland, and you guys, majority are spread across the US. So thank you very much and good evening.